Yolande Bouka is part of a small group of emerging young scholars on social justice, power, and resistance in the African Great Lakes region. Her work investigates the reintegration of released prisoners of the Rwandan Genocide and analyzes their experiences in the transitional justice system. Her research aims to understand how power relations and the transitional justice mechanisms allow the state to control and structure conceptions of criminality, justice, and truth. In the course of her research, she spent 4 months interviewing released prisoners of the Rwandan Genocide. She completed a master's degree in international relations from the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University, where she specialized in global health and security, with a particular emphasis on issues related to HIV/AIDS prevalence in African militaries and humanitarian interventions. While completing her degree, she worked as an adjunct faculty in the Modern Languages Department, served as an intern for the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, worked as a research associate for the Public International Law and Policy Group, and also worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace in their Rule of Law Department. Yolande Bouka received a BA in both International Studies and French with a minor in Middle East Studies from the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies and Brigham Young University. She and her husband, Kofi, and their son, Elijah, live in Washington, D.C. Sorry to say Kofi was not able to come, but Elijah is here with us today. We may be hearing from him, or at least we hope. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome Yolande back to campus. She was a well-known student here in the Kennedy Center and worked as a research assistant with a number of our programs. I think there were at least a couple of different of UN conferences that we attended, particularly one in Dakar, Senegal, that was quite memorable, relating to the UN. Today, her topic: Justice Through Their Eyes: The Legal Journey of Released Prisoners of the Rwandan Genocide. Please join me in welcoming Yolande Bouka.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure and an honor to be back here at the Kennedy Center. In spring 2004, no, actually it was spring 2000. Spring 2000, it's a long time ago. Spring 2000, I was, one of you, I was sitting right here in the Kennedy Center listening to one of the lectures, and it's kind of interesting to come full circle. And I kind of feel intimidated because I feel like I'm coming back to report on what I've been doing in the past, decade. And I remember also very specifically sitting here and listening to Corey telling a group of students not to let school get in the way of our education. And I've sometimes listened to that model a little bit too closely because I wasn't that great of a student all the time. But I've also taken that to heart by realizing that in order to be able to really understand what's going on underground in conflict zones, I needed to be there myself. And I needed to talk to the people who've experienced it in order to get a sense of how they understand their position, how they understand what happened to them, as opposed to getting an outsider's view and reading it in the newspaper. And what is really interesting about my research is that I realized by going in the field in Rwanda that what I had read in the newspaper, in the New York Times, and The Economist, and all the other CNN and other media outlets wasn't necessarily what had happened in Rwanda. What we know about the story of Rwanda really comes from maybe Hotel Rwanda, a book called We Wish to Inform You. I don't know if you're familiar with the literature on Rwanda. There's also a book called The Problem from Hell. And maybe if you're a little bit into the genocide a little bit more than others, you might have read A Machete Season. But those are very superficial analysis of what happened in Rwanda, starting in 1990 all the way to 2000. The genocide can't be understood in a vacuum. You can't say the genocide started in April 1994 and ended in July and try to understand it from those dates. we understand very little about all the actors that were involved and the multiplicity of their role and identities during the conflict in the Great Lakes region. Now, I always have to give a disclaimer when I give one of those presentations because unlike a lot of the research that is done on Rwanda and the genocide, I'm not looking to investigate the survivor side of the story. There's a lot of books, there's been a lot of reports on the survivor side. How did they manage to survive? How did they now reconcile with the members of their communities? I'm on the other side, the people who've been accused of the genocide. And I have to put the disclaimer, I'm not a genocide denier. And the reason why I have to say that from the beginning is because the Rwandan government has been very good at discrediting researchers who put out a narrative that is different from theirs. There's a very official narrative of how the genocide happened. They want to stick to the story because the story they tell helps buttress their standing in the government. I know the genocide happened. I've seen the graves. I've seen the people who suffered from the genocide. I've seen people who told me about how they lost children, how they lost relatives to the genocide. In 1994, I was in my home in Montreal, where I had good friends from Rwanda who were concerned about their relatives and couldn't get a hold of them during the genocide. I know it happened. But what I also know is that before the genocide took place, there was a civil war in Rwanda, which is something that the government does not like to talk about because in 1990, the current regime was not in power. It was a rebel force coming from Uganda. I also know that in 1995, 1996, and 1997, the current government was heavily involved in the Eastern Congo. And the current regime in Rwanda attacked refugee camps, which is against international law, in the dead of night in order to be able to target people who were involved in the genocide. However, in the process, they killed thousands of children, of women, of elderly people who could not outrun the bullets. So giving this type of information and researching this topic makes people like me and Susan Thompson and Ann Omson and other researchers of my generation very unpopular in Rwanda. I am unsure whether by the end of the time that I finish my dissertation, I will be allowed to return to Rwanda. So this is my disclaimer before I get started, just so we know and we are honest about where we stand vis-a-vis the research. So my interest in this particular topic started by, I wanted to understand how post-conflict justice, so any type of mechanism, whether it be truth commissions, whether it be international tribunals, how do those mechanisms help people reconcile, go back home after conflict, and be able to live side by side with the people who oppress them. But when it came down to narrow down my research, I decided to study social capital, social cohesion. And maybe I put a hypothesis out there. I said, well, maybe post-conflict justice helps people reconcile because it helps forge social capital. It helps people understand where the other comes from and bridge the relationship that they formerly had. But once in the field, I wrote my dissertation prospectus, and I was ready to defend my prospectus, and I decided to go to the field before that. And once I got in the field, well, of course, my research question went out the window, because first of all, I realized that post-conflict justice in Rwanda was much more complicated than I thought it was. But like a lot of people who do ethnographic research, I realized that a lot more questions were out there than I hadn't thought about. And some of those questions were much more interesting than my initial topic. So I was able to meet with this man who has an NGO who works exclusively with released prisoners of the genocide. And he said, if you follow me and if you work with me, I can show you a side of Rwanda that people don't want to talk about. So I communicated with the members of my committee, because of course I have to get everything through them so they can approve. And I said, well, this is what's happening to me right now in the field. What should I do? And one of my advisors has been very involved. Her research is focused on militia groups in the United States and in South America. She said, jump on it. Forget whatever you wrote your perspectives on, jump on it. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And this is what I did. So for about 4 months, I went and interviewed released prisoners of the genocide. Now, I don't call them perpetrators, and I think it's important to make the distinctions. Some of them were perpetrators of the genocide, were confessed killers, but others were falsely accused. So we called them released prisoners of the genocide because they were arrested, incarcerated. Most of them were tried and found either guilty or not guilty of the crimes committed. And I think in our vision and our understanding of the genocide, oftentimes we have a tendency to oversimplify the reality of post-genocide life. We say they were perpetrators, they were survivors, and they were bystanders. But we realize that we start studying that people have a lot of roles. Some people were perpetrators at times and rescuers at others. There's a great book by Refugee, if you're interested, called Killing Neighbors, Webs of Violence in Rwanda. And she studies how a single individual could have different roles at the time of the genocide. When everybody was looking, they felt obligated to kill with other people. But as soon as the authorities weren't looking, they did as much as they could to rescue their Tutsi neighbors because that's not what they wanted to do. At other times, they couldn't rescue somebody themselves, but they sent people at other places with other families to be protected. Again, this is this type of thing that we don't hear enough about in the research on genocide. So let's talk a little bit about the context of my research. Where was I? What were the things on the ground when I conducted my research? First of all, we all know that there's been, I hope we do, and if we don't now, we know, that hundreds of thousands of men and women were arrested for genocide crimes. And the current Rwanda Transitional Justice Program has 3 branches. First, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which is located in Arusha, Tanzania. I had the opportunity to go there and also interview some of the employees there, but it's not in the scope of this presentation, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. You have first instance courts, which are regular courts like we have here in the United States and other Western countries and around the world. Regular traditional tribunals. But because of the amount of people who were involved or allegedly involved in a genocide, trying all these people through traditional, through classical courts would have taken over 100 years. So the government decided to engineer and to get back a traditional method called gacaca. Gacaca it really means justice it means on the grass. It's an old mechanism that was not used for criminal prosecution before colonization. It was in fact used to resolve civil conflict, property disputes between people. Now, there is a lot of literature on gacaca. If you're interested, go ahead and look for it. Some people praise gacaca, others find a lot of shortcomings with the mechanism because in the beginning, it wasn't meant for criminal prosecution. What you have is people testifying about what they saw. The government wants to involve the community to discuss what they saw, to encourage people to testify. Because shortly after the genocide, it was very difficult for survivors and witnesses to come forward because sometimes there were threats made against them that if they testified, they would be killed. Others don't want to testify because they can't give a full testimony. They want to say what they saw during the genocide, but not only on the side of those we know are the perpetrators of the genocide, but they wanted to accuse the government. They said, well, yeah, the genocide happened, but there's other things that the government did, but I'm not allowed to talk about it, so I don't want to participate in this justice system. I encourage you to do a lot of research on gacaca. I think it's an imperfect model, but that was necessary to deal with fighting impunity in Rwanda. Now, this is something that I talked about a few seconds ago. The jurisprudence focuses only on genocide crimes, and they're very narrowly defined genocide crimes. So to put it simply, if you're Hutu and you're accused of a crime that happened between the beginning of 1990 till the end of 1994 against a Tutsi, it is considered a genocide crime. So the victim has to be Tutsi most of the time, and the person guilty or the accused has to be Hutu most of the time. If the roles are reversed, if the Tutsi is the accused and the Hutu is the victim, then people will be less likely to bring the cases in front of Gacaca, because people will tell them, how dare you? How dare you come here and talk about you, Hutu, as a victim, when we all know that most of the victims of the genocides were Tutsi? This is not the time nor the place to bring such accusations. And what will happen is that people will decide not to bring those cases. So all the Tutsi who were victims of violence during the genocide, most of them do not have a forum where they can bring about their grievances. The transitional justice program is also put in a system, a project of unity and reconciliation. They have a commission of unity and reconciliation in Rwanda. And I was able to interview the executive secretary of that government branch. And it's really interesting. They're really trying to bring the Rwandese people together. The problem, however, is that it's not voluntary. The government tells you you have to reconcile. You have to forgive. Now, we are all, as BYU students, I'm assuming, familiar with the concept of forgiveness. And we are also familiar that we can't force people to forgive. So what happens oftentimes is people will say, yes, I've forgiven my neighbor. We gusangira, which is the concept that's right here at the bottom. Gusangira means to share. Share beer, share food. It's a symbolic act, which means that people are back together in the community. So what you often hear people is say, yes, we gusangira, we're reconciled. When I see this person, I say hello. I talk, I make small talk. But when you ask them, so if the government put in place a law that allowed you to sue this person, would you do it? And they always tell you in a heartbeat. But they almost whisper it because they don't want their neighbors to hear. So you wonder, how can you be reconciled with someone that you just want to sue, that you just want to, have revenge against? Like, well, the government tells us that we have to be reconciled. We have to live together again. So we do it. So we pretend reconciliation. So that's problematic because you have a post-conflict justice system in which we and the entire international community has spent a lot of money. We have a lot invested in this program. You have an international tribunal, you have national courts, and you have Gacaca, through which hundreds of people have gone through so far. So in my research of post-conflict justice in Latin America and the Balkans, I've never seen a mechanism that takes the need for accountability to the very lowest level of society. The lay peasant is also prosecuted, which usually doesn't happen. What you have is a truth commission. What you have is criminal prosecution of military commanders, people in government, but you rarely, in fact, never have a case where the lay peasant is also prosecuted. So how can we spend all this time and money and effort and people only pretend reconciliation? So is post-conflict justice really useful in the end? And that was my question. I wanted to know, there had to be a power aspect to this. Now, if law divorced from power is indeed unthinkable, think about this. Even in our beautiful legal system, if you have a lot of money, you usually have a very good legal team. If you don't have a lot of money, what do you get? A public defender, and you hope that the public defender has the time and resources to defend you. But we also know that because people who don't have a lot of money oftentimes don't get as good a legal representation as people who have a lot of money. There's certain crimes that are prosecuted, other crimes that well, depending on what you have to exchange to the prosecutor, he might not prosecute you. So this is in a system that we think is very efficient in spite of its shortcoming. But in a system where the legal process is controlled by the state, and controlled by a regime that is set to say a story about the genocide, then you have significant power asymmetry. Then my question is, how does this power circulate in the transitional justice system? And how does it impact how people interact with each other? Once you've gone through the legal justice system, once you've gone through the criminal justice system, who do you become? Who can you trust? Who are you willing to call your neighbor? And who do you decide is now a foe forever? So I'm going to talk briefly about my method, because it's always important to talk about this. People can challenge it, and I'm welcome to people challenging my method. But I think it was pretty similar to methodology that's been used in similar research. So I combined 3 distinct methods of research. First, I did in-depth interviewing. So I interviewed released prisoners of the genocide. I also interviewed their spouses when it was possible. The majority of the former prisoners that I interviewed were male. I was able to interview 71 former prisoners, and only 4 of them were women. And it's quite representative of the number of women that were incarcerated following the genocide. Women were also involved in the genocide, but they weren't involved in violent crimes as much as men. They would mostly tell people, the militias, where people were hiding. They would loot houses at the end of killing, collect whatever was left in homes. But it was really interesting to see the side of women, and also the side of spouses. What is the impact of their husband's incarceration on their daily lives? They become pariahs in their communities, simply because their husband is accused and not necessarily proven to have participated in the genocide. Their children have difficulties going to school because they don't have enough money to put them through school, because the children have to stay home and work to allow the family to survive, and so forth. And I also interviewed about 10 prisoners to check different variation of the data. I wanted to know whether it, once released, impacted how one remembered incarceration and arrest and the experience in Congo. And in fact, there was very similar narratives from the prisoners and the released prisoners, but there's also very specific data that is quite different, actually. I also did a lot of critical discourse analysis, trying to understand how the state wants you to believe certain things happened. I studied speeches from prime ministers in Rwanda and the current president of the Rwanda, how he defined concepts such as criminality, justice, truth, and lies. I looked at the laws that were in place, and I also looked at interviews and government reports. And I did what's called political ethnography. And there is a difference between conducting in-depth interviews and ethnography. You can't just go in the field and ask people questions and say, I did ethnographic field work. Ethnographic field work, or in my case, political ethnography, involves day-to-day interaction with the people you meet. So what I did is I completely pulled myself out of the expatriate networks that were available in Rwanda. I didn't hang out with expats at all. What I did is I spent most of my time with people from Rwanda, daily interactions. I went to funerals. I went to weddings. I went to, what's it called? I went to different field projects with people who were working in Rwanda. I went to the local market and talked to people, and my daily interaction informed some of the research and some of the data that I had collected through my in-depth interviewing. And it's quite interesting because once you take those interview data out of context, you get a completely different analysis than when you contextualize it with daily experiences of the people in the country. My research site was in northern Rwanda. And I want to spend a couple of seconds, and I'm already looking at the time, and I'm spending too much time on this. I want to spend a couple of seconds talking about the Rwanda and the difference between the North and the South. There's a lot less Tutsi living in the North than in the South. Much more killings took place in the southern part of Rwanda, which means that a lot of researchers usually go to a city like Butare. Right here. A lot of organizations, universities send their students there because there's a wealth of information about what happened in 1994. As a result, the North is often under-researched. The problem with this is the Civil War took place in that region right there, between Byumba and Gisenyi in the northern part of the country. So people who live in that region not only can tell you a little bit about the genocide as the rest of the country, but they can also tell you what happened in October 1990 when the RPF invaded the country, which contextualizes your understanding of the genocide. The genocide didn't just happen one day. People got up, took machetes, and went crazy. No. Something happened before that. And the people who live in that region can tell you, yes, the RPF came to Rwanda in 1990, and they also killed civilians. And when I talk about justice, that's what I would hear a lot. When I think about the word justice, I don't only hear justice for the genocide victims, but I also hear justice for the war crime victims that we're not allowed to talk about in the country. So, crimes defined, there's 3 categories of genocide crimes. There are those that are the planners, the organizers, people who were involved in sexual violence are considered the first category. The second category are people who were involved in murder and assault and also were accomplices. To be an accomplice, you had to simply be there. A lot of people were dragged out of their homes to participate in the genocide. They never took a weapon, they never wanted to be there, but they knew that if they didn't, their families were going to be killed. So they sat on the side and kind of looked at what was going on, never participated, but they're considered to be accomplices because there's no such thing as mitigating circumstances in Gacaca trial. You can't say, I had a gun to my head, or they had a gun to my child's head, so I had to go. That doesn't work in the system. So whether or not you were forced or to go and participate in a genocide, you're considered an accomplice if you didn't have a weapon in hand. And the third category is anybody that's involved in property crimes, who stole property that belonged to Tutsi following the genocide. And that brought me to think about something. What is criminalized during warfare? What can you consider a crime? And the reason why I asked this is because I remember one day talking to a released prisoner who was eventually exonerated of the crimes, the charges brought against him, and he said, well, he still had to pay money to compensate for his wife after the genocide. A few weeks after the genocide, there was this house right next to theirs who had been abandoned, and in fact, I think the person who lived there had been killed. So she needed heating wood to cook for her family. So she decided to go and take the door of the neighbor who had been killed to use as heating wood. His wife is considered a genocide criminal. And it really brought to I really started asking myself, should this be considered a crime? Now, she didn't have to go to prison for it, but her husband had to pay money. But she's forever labeled as a genocide criminal. And when we think about genocide criminal, we're thinking about somebody wielding a machete. So there's an image, there's an identity imposed on that particular person for an action that was committed in a time of war. However, had the roles been reversed and that door stolen by a Tutsi, a Hutu would never dare to bring that case to Gacaca. So that crime automatically does not exist. And that actually just touches on the point that's below right there. You also have new laws imposed by the transitional justice mechanism, such as genocidal ideology or defamation. So if you criticize the president and say, well, President Kagame, during the war in Congo, you knew that your troops were involved in killing and raping women in refugee camp. That's defamation. And that can land you in jail. And the government has been using this to keep people out of political office. Very recently, a woman called Victoire returned to Rwanda to run for the presidential elections. And she started in this very discourse, saying, yes, we understand that the genocide took place. However, we need to recognize that the current government and the president were involved in crimes also. Well, the elections took place. She was arrested shortly before the election. She was never allowed to present herself and to run for election. She's still in jail currently and denied bail for that. There's also a law that says if you're accused of the crime, if you're found guilty of that crime and you spend more than 6 months in prison, you're no longer allowed to run for political office. So it's a pretty good strategy, because that way this woman probably will never be able to run for president again. So I'm going to skip this because I think I talked a little bit about this. And as I go along, and I'm going to try to only spend the next 5 minutes and maybe allow the next 10 minutes after that for questions. I'm going to keep those quotes on the PowerPoint. You can read them for yourself. But and I'm going to go over the general findings that I found about the legal journey of released prisoners of the genocide. Usually arrests took place in a very violent way in Rwanda following the genocide. The military was in charge. The new military was in charge of arresting people. They would go to people's houses without warrants because the country was completely destroyed after the war and the genocide. And, you know, I like this story. He said, you know, I was summoned, so I went because I had heard, in fact, that people who didn't go would usually get killed. That was very shortly after the genocide. You were called, you went. If you didn't go, you were killed. So there wasn't a question of, you know, should I run away? And that was always what came to my mind. And when I would ask those questions, why didn't you make a run for it? They didn't come to get you automatically. They told you that you needed to come to the commune office, which is kind of like the town, the mayor's office. I would have made a run for it. And they told me, no, where would you run? The military was everywhere. So you knew you stood a better chance by going than by trying to run away. And when they were arrested, particularly between 1994 and 2000, people were usually severely beaten when arrested. I could see the scars on people's bodies from, you know, the beating that they received in the local jails. But they always told me that once they got to the central prison, they felt relief because they knew that they were no longer going to be beaten by the authorities. But in the local prisons where their neighbors were there, people who had lived with them for a long time, where even the population was allowed to go to prison and beat prisoners. Sometimes it wasn't necessarily the people who were accused of killing their relatives, but the level of anger and pain that the Tutsis felt following the genocide was so great that they would beat anyone that was accused of a genocide crime. A lot of them were tortured in prison. And I remember one of the respondents I talked to, I asked him whether or not he had been tortured in prison, and he told me, well, what kind of question is this? Don't you know that once you're in authority, you automatically use torture to get to what you want? I never was able to get whether this man himself was tortured, but he had an understanding that once you were in authority, you had the right to use torture as a way to get answers. And that's what was used very often to force people to confess. People denied, no, I didn't kill so-and-so. And they would, you know, you have a pretty good, you know, idea of how the type of very violent way in which people were tortured. Pre-trial detention, and this is something that blew my mind. And I just thought that this question and answer was very simple. When were you arrested? In 1997. When were you tried? In 2007. Some people spend 10 years in pretrial detention. Now, let's keep in mind, some people killed more than dozens of people. So I don't feel particularly bad for people who spend 10 years in prison. The problem is the people who didn't participate in a genocide. By simply being accused of being a genocide killer, oftentimes you spend that much time just to have your trial, just to have your day in court. And by that time, you were sick. You had contracted some sort of infectious disease. The food was not adequate. Your wife had left you because she couldn't figure out where you were. She had heard from someone that you were arrested, but oftentimes people died in prison, so they had the sense, well, he probably died, so I'm going to go ahead and remarry. Well, those people would come home and find that their spouses are remarried and have children. And that's very problematic because you have family dislocation as a result of those lengthy pretrial incarceration. Needless to say that trials are not necessarily, don't always bring about the truth about what really happened during the genocide. The first instance court used to be used before gacaca was put in place, but now most people are tried by gacaca. There's no legal representation. You do not have the right to a lawyer. What you have is the Inyangamugayos, who are what you can call the wise one, who are elected by the local people to decide the fate of the accused. In one case, I witnessed a gacaca trial where the entire panel of Inyangamugayos were genocide survivors, which was a problem because the person who was being tried was a person of the first category, a local authority. And the understanding was, if you're a local authority, if you were a local authority during the genocide, you automatically had to be an accomplice. You had to have been involved in the planning of the genocide. So there was no use for that man to stand trial in front of those Inyangamugayo because they thought he was guilty. He didn't need to come and explain his situation. They had already decided the verdict before the trial had begun. So you have different levels of victimhood of those very former detainees. Now, I think you also have to remember that a lot of them are actual génocidaires. They are actual killers. However, what is our legal responsibility to people who are accused of crimes? And that's where the problem comes. We can say, yes, maybe 80% of them were killers, but don't they have the right to explain under what circumstances they killed? Don't they have the right to explain, no, actually, I didn't kill. I wasn't even in the region when it happened. From the moment you're accused of genocide crimes, the community around you automatically assumes that you are indeed a criminal. So there are what I like to call justice injustices. You have this respondent here who says, some people have found their houses destroyed, their family killed, and they haven't done anything at all. But the mere fact that I was accused of genocide makes me a criminal. So there are identity imposed and identities denied by the justice system. From the moment you go through the justice system, your identity is a génocidaire. You're an ex-con. You're an unworthy witness. And you're only a partial citizen because from now on, you can no longer run for political office, even at the lowest level of society. But the identities that are denied is, some of them are victims of other crimes than genocide. Some of them are witnesses. And some of them are fathers. It was really amazing to sit down with some of those accused of genocide and to see them as something other than a killer. This man, really touched me because I saw him holding his child and saying, I was there when somebody was killed. I take full responsibility, but I just don't understand why I had to spend so much time in jail, when I really didn't kill anyone. And he had the papers to show me, the legal papers showing that he had been exonerated of the crimes that he'd been accused of. And he told me about so many of his family members who had been killed in the refugee camps in Congo. And this last quote from a man that I met saying, "Thank you for listening to my story. For the first time in a long time, I feel like a man." So the good prevails. We are prosecuting genocide crimes. And the government is very good at it. However, in the meantime, the small sins like war crimes, crimes against humanity, they're just swept under the rug. And we're not paying attention to this. Because not everyone who left the country, who fled after the genocide, is in fact a killer. But the simple fact that you went through that justice system, the label is attached to you for life. Thank you. So I know a lot of you have class, but for those who can stay, I'm willing to take questions. And I think somebody's in charge of the mic. Okay. Hi.
I did a little bit of reading on the, I believe it's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa.
Yes.
And they've received some criticism for offering amnesty to people that were involved in human rights abuses if they're willing to describe in detail what they witnessed and what they participated in.
Yeah.
One question I have is, has that been at all used in Rwanda, that practice in trying to draw out information?
Absolutely not.
No? Okay. And I was going to ask, what are your thoughts generally on that practice?
I think it's very difficult. I think had I been in the shoes of the people in place right now, it'd be a very difficult situation. Apartheid government, the level of violence was not as intimate in terms of neighbors killing neighbors as a genocide. One of the good things that the amnesty brought to South Africa is that people felt that they were okay to express really freely what they had done during the genocide, during apartheid. The problem with prosecution in Rwanda is that it becomes an adversarial process. People sometimes only say what they know is going to get them out of jail. But you do have people who are willing to confess everything. But oftentimes the truth doesn't all come out in those processes. Another thing that you have with prosecution that's difficult to arrive to is reconciliation. Because people come to court and they're determined to have you imprisoned for life. And I can't really blame them. They've heard through the grapevine that you were the one who was present when their family was killed. So their idea, and I think it would be, the natural response as a human being to want you to go to prison. So what happens oftentimes is people do the math, because the government has encouraged people in Rwanda to confess. And they say, well, if you confess, we'll reduce your sentence. Kind of a plea bargaining. So people look at the time and they say, well, I've been in prison for 10 years. If I confess to this crime, I get 8, so I get out. So they don't always confess to the truth. Another problem you have is people confessing and they say you can buy an entire hill. They confess to all the crimes, or the majority of the crimes that took place in a particular area, in order to protect their siblings. They were like, well, I'm old, I'm already in prison, I've already been in prison for 10 years. There's no use to get all my other siblings involved. So it becomes a bargain. People don't say necessarily what really happens. But I don't want this answer to mean that people don't confess. You've had people who were able to know where their loved ones were buried, to give them proper burial. Those two cases are very different. I've talked to a legal expert who told me that in the end, Rwanda would have to have a truth commission in order to have all the truth come out on both sides of the conflict. And I think that's a fair answer. That in fact, indeed, at one point it will be necessary. Yeah. Any more questions? No? Yeah.
Name is Nathan Wirtz, international relations major. I have just one really quick question about your political ethnography studies. With that, and the fact that we have all of this injustice trying to be fixed with more injustice, how do you see the future of Rwanda in trying to really overcome this and to have a unified society again, politically speaking? is there really any hope for this in the future with all of this injustice going on? Or what are your thoughts on that?
A lot of the people that I've been talking to are very concerned that what you see right now is the calm before the storm. What you have is a minority completely controlling every single political aspect of Rwanda. Excuse me, the Tutsi are about 12 to 15% of the population. They control the economy, they control the army, they control the police forces, they control the legal system, and so forth. President Kagame is very good at picking who he wants and where, and if you disagree with his system, he simply kicks you out. And those are tactics that were used by President Habyarimana, the former president of Rwanda. The very same tactics to silence people, to repress people, were used by that government. So if there's hope in the future that Rwanda can be a united society, I think so. I don't think that you can say that a society is doomed to be divided forever. But in the short term, in the next few years, it'll be very interesting to see once Kagame leave office, because apparently he promised he would leave office in the next 7 years at the end of his term. That is yet to be seen. I'll see that when it happens. But when he does, you'll have a power vacuum. What happens after that? So in the next 10 to 15 years, it'll be interesting to see whether violence will return to Rwanda. Most people that work in my circle believe that violence will return to Rwanda. But, I can't guess whether or not it will. One more question here.
I just want to make sure that, I just want to better understand the Gacaca court system. Gacaca court system. So it's imposed by the government for genocide specifically. Is it more like a tribal system, or like who are the judges and how?
The judges are the members of the community. Okay. It's not tribal at all.
Okay, so it's just the members of the community.
It's the members of community that are believed to be honest, virtuous people, and people vote for them. And at the end, you have a panel, I think, of 8, and don't quote me on the number. But they're supposed to be judges, but in a lot of cases, they're prosecutors at the same time. Which is problematic, because you shouldn't be the one, judging and finally having the verdict if you're going to ask prosecutorial questions in the process. But it's a system that has brought some comfort to some, because they were able to get some sort of truth and some sort of closure where the remains of their loved ones were hidden. You've had and I don't want people to believe that there has been absolutely no reconciliation. It has had some impact for some. But the vast majority of the Tutsi will tell you, well, it's not fair. Because what Gacaca brings is that it brings people to say what gets them out of jail most of the time. Often, some other times, they'll bring them to say the truth. But the person who says, yes, I killed 10 people, and I've talked to one of these men. I killed 10 people, but I confessed in Gacaca. So with time served, I was out of prison. And you have people who refuse to confess because they say, I did not do anything, and I will not confess to something that I have not done. So they're still awaiting trial. Because once you're willing to confess and the government accepts your confession, you can go free while you await trial. That's as of a few years ago. The government's been releasing people while they await trial. So all you need to do is say, yeah, I confess. I killed, or yes, I stole something. And if the government, after a little bit of investigation, decide that it's a true confession, then you can go out and go free. But the people who refuse to confess, some of them, of course, it's because they've killed so many people that it'd be too long to talk about it. But others, it's because they don't want to confess to something they haven't done. So you get punished for not being willing to confess. And the genocide killers will tell you, well, Gacaca is great because I can go free. I don't know. But at the same time, if you keep those hundreds of people incarcerated, how can you ever have reconciliation? So it's a catch-22. It's very difficult. Now that I'm a mother, I'm thinking, if somebody had done that to my child, would I be willing to forgive? I have a good understanding of the gospel. I am a Latter-day Saint. I love to believe in the atonement of Jesus Christ, but I know my shortcomings. I know who I am as a person. I find it very, and I get a little bit emotional. I find it very difficult to conceive being able to forgive somebody who does this to your child. reconciliation is a process. It's not an event. And I don't know how, and the Rwandese often tell foreign critics, let us do what is best for us. You know, we know best what's best for our people. You know, all you can do is really bring analysis, bring light to these situations and say, I hope they are able to fix these problems. There's no perfect way to bring reconciliation in a situation like this. Okay, I think we're good.